Okay, so woody plants. So when we talk about woody plants, we're also including, of course, the shrubs into this and other plants that maybe we don't necessarily think as woody plants. We don't really consider like palm trees in a proper discussion of woody plants because I think Tom kind of mentioned this last week, they actually more fall under the herbaceous category. They don't develop true wood. And so when we talk about woody plants, we usually are talking about trees and shrubs, vines and ground covers, and there's a lot of blurring of the lines between these categories. But a tree, generally we're talking about a dominant central leader that's taller than 15 feet. So, and this is where we kind of get into the nuance of having large shrubs or small trees. And so I think that it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of, these are just general industry kind of accepted working terms. A shrub usually has multiple upright branches and is usually less than about 15 feet tall. So a large shrub, you think of a big old lilac, or sometimes choke cherry can be in either category, right? We could kind of lump it under either category. It's usually kind of considered a small tree and multiple stems or not. So, and then you've got some small maples that could kind of go either way. And sometimes training them and pruning them when they're little can kind of move them into that multi-stemmed form versus the upright form, more of a single stem form. And then vines are slender stems that require support. So vines, woody vines in this case, they're all cheaters. So they develop wood, but not to the extent that in most cases it becomes structural, that i.e. they can't support themselves. And we can train vines to support themselves. We can do it with wisteria, for example. We can do it with grapes, where they do form a sturdy enough trunk over time, but they require staking initially for a number of years, and then they have to be weaned off of that, and then they can gradually build up enough what we call reaction wood to deal with that stress of standing up on their own. But the whole point of vines, and the reason that they typically grow quite rapidly, is because they're not putting the same amount of energy into structure as a proper tree would, that has to deal with all the wind. So you look at the ivy that's here in the picture on the right there, that's climbing up the wall. We've got English ivy. It grows pretty quickly because it's using the wall for support. So it doesn't have to build structural tissue to handle that. And you've probably seen like trumpet vine or Virginia creeper climbing up a telephone pole, or maybe overtaking your spruce tree in your yard or something like that, right? So there's those cheaters in that sense. And then we have the ground covers, and these are basically just prostrate versions of shrubs and vines and other herbaceous plants too. Lots of herbaceous plants fit that category. But like there's what we consider, there's ground cover pine trees, like there's ground cover Scotch pines, and they only get about knee high. So there's lots of woody plants that have been selected either through natural selection or they've been bred to be very low growing. And so even though they're trees in the proper sense, they really kind of function as ground covers. And we have a lot of junipers and things that do that. And the picture that's shown here is basically just a little ground cover spruce, the very bottom picture. So lots of cultivars are available in a variety of forms. And I teach an herbaceous plants class online. And one of the first things I tell the students is that I don't spend a lot of time drilling down to talk that much about individual cultivars, except for when there are specific, maybe very important cultivars that are the predominant thing in the industry. And the reason for that is that there are so many available and they change all the time based on trends. And it's more important to kind of understand the basics of the parent or the base species, and then learn about the different cultivars that are available. And those change pretty quickly. You'll have trends in, like Fat Albert spruce was really trendy for a long time, but they're not so trendy now. Does that make sense? So they kind of move through based on just what's novel, because those tend to sell the best. So there's lots and lots of forms available. And so when people are looking for like a tree to fit into their yard, it's good to just go to the nurseries and look and see what they have available. But after you've kind of narrowed it down to say, I'm considering these kinds of species because they'll probably work well in my situation. So you know that if you have a salty clay loam soil with high pH, maples are probably not going to be the answer for you, right? So you can look for other groups, look for oaks and others that would do better in those situations. And then there's lots of cultivars in those that can fit lots of different forms. So with yards for most people becoming very, very small or absent altogether, breeders have responded to this and plantsmen have responded to this in making forms of woody plants that are much smaller, much more compact, maybe much narrower than say 50 years ago when you could find, only a handful of cultivars of say spruces or pine trees. Now we can find weeping forms that don't have as broad a canopy. We can find more columnar forms. We can find more shrubby forms and tighter vase forms. And, a real trendy one right now is a vase-shaped tree, Zelkova, but there was a variety that came out several years ago called Wireless. And that was a form that is really short. So it's more suitable for using around power lines. And that's where the name Wireless came from. And so it's just kind of getting out there and looking to see how the industry is responding to the different pressures that are put on it from landscapes, what people demand in their landscapes. But there's just a lot of options out there. And it's also important to understand that when we try and put a plant in the wrong space, the difference between the natural form of that plant and its natural environment and the space that we want to put it in. So whatever the desired landscape goal that is, it's got to fit a certain space. It needs to occupy this area. It needs to provide this amount of shade or whatever, or screening or whatever it is. Whatever the difference is from what it needs naturally, what it's adapted to naturally, and the places we put it in the landscape, we have to make up that difference by management or maintenance. So you put a large tree in a small space, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to prune it a lot. Exactly. And so a lot of times then by proper plant selection, we can eliminate or at least potentially reduce the amount of problems that we're going to have in future performance with that plant in the landscape. The plants will be healthier and we won't have to go out and try and make up that difference in management. So looking at these plants here, so this is quite an old picture, obviously, but that's some old topiary that's right outside the most annoying ride at Disneyland, right outside It's a Small World. And so none of those are obviously the natural forms for those yews and boxwoods that they're using there. And they're shearing those every week. They're trimming those every week, right? To make it look like that. So a huge amount of maintenance, but in reality, those shrubs left on their own will look more like the picture on the left. Big, tall, and that one's been sheared as well. As you can see genetically, but they're going to be much bigger than that. And we can maintain them smaller, but just understand that there's that input that we have to make and that those kind of activities are also going to be stressful for the plants to some extent because as they're using energy to grow, we're continually cutting it off. And so it puts them under basically food stress. So these benefits to woody plants are pretty tremendous. And we have the ability to select from a large palette of plant materials. And so a big part of this conversation will be trying to pin those things together, putting the right plant in the right place. If I can get this thing. All right, so I've kind of hit on this already, but we're looking at hardiness, size and growth rate, tolerances to different soil conditions, shape and form, fruit, which may be showy, but may be a nuisance. There's a lot of nuisances. One of the questions that we get, Ton and I get quite a bit is, well, what's a good tree that won't be messy? Or what's a good fast growing tree? Well, good and fast growing usually aren't used in the same sentence. And so we have to understand that with any plant, particularly with woody plants, there's never a perfect plant. So if you have a plant that has a lot of spring flowers, probably going to have a lot of fall fruit, right? There are some examples of fruitless, like crab apples and things, but more or less, that's what you get. So the only part I wanted to talk about this in any time is the link at the bottom, the treebrowser.org. So our extension forestry specialist, Mike Coons, who's now retired, a number of years ago, he and a bunch of students put together a website, and you can, I think, still get the app for your phones or your mobile device, just this treebrowser.org. And there's 245 trees in it that they've found around the state. And there's a fact sheet on each one. There's pictures. You can click on them and see what more information about each one of those. And you can also filter the list for tolerances to, say, high soil pH or salt conditions. You can filter it by size and growth rate, and they define what those parameters are in the information side. So you can filter it down. And when people ask me, well, what should I plant? I will oftentimes send them here and say, well, use this to kind of give you a baseline to start looking for stuff. And then once you've narrowed it down to maybe a list of plants you want to look at, go to the nurseries and see what they have available in those species, and then evaluate it further. So it's really just a starting point. And also, not everything in there is stuff that we would recommend. So yeah, there's cottonwood and willow and things. And for a lot of landscapes, we don't recommend those because they're really trashy. They're weak wooded. They tend to have a lot of disease problems or other pest problems. And so, but they're there to give you information about them. But I really encourage you, if you're going to use any resources like that, to do more research to evaluate, is it really suitable for you? Just because it grows here in landscapes doesn't mean it will be suitable for you. So woody plants are available in three main ways. And to homeowners, really only the middle one and the bottom one. Bare root, balled and burlap, or we just simply say B&B, and containerized. Most homeowners don't have much access to bare root stuff. And we'll talk about all of those in turn in just a minute. And then we also talk about establishment time. And this gets into some of my graduate work and a whole nother set of topics. But essentially, for about every 1 inch of trunk caliper, the general rule of thumb is it takes about a year for the roots to grow out enough that the plant is uptaking nutrients and water and growing normally again, kind of getting back to where it was before it was transplanted. In Utah, it's probably a lot longer than that. So in our experience, it seems to be probably more like 2 years, because our climate is pretty harsh. We have really bright light, which is intense. We have low humidity. Typically, we have dry soils, high pH soils, and that slows plant growth and establishment down. So if we're in Florida, we might have a plant established easily within a year's time, but we won't see that same growth rate for 2 or 3 years in our climate. For every 1 inch of trunk caliper, you should have 10 to 12 inches of the root ball. So I all the time in the online forums or like on Facebook and stuff, people are saying, well, I want to move this tree, I want to move this plant, I want to move this grape, it's whatever. Well, if you're going to do it, you got to do it with small stuff, and it's going to take more root area, more soil probably than you can physically move. So it becomes really tricky. You can move them bare root, but that's even more stressful and more damaging and a lot more risky, but it can be done, and it's lighter, but you still need to keep to that rule on how much root to have. And we'll talk about the planting hole, but that planting hole and how you put the tree in the plant is far more important almost than any other cultural practice except for irrigation. because a lot of the landscape problems that I get called in to look at, I can trace probably the vast majority of them, I can trace back to planting issues. Planted too deep, it's got packaging materials on it, whatever. So we'll talk about balled and burlaps first. These are moderately available, so that means that you can find them, but not everywhere. And you'll be able to find some species, but not nearly as many as you would find if you were buying containerized. So they offer typically quite good establishment as long as the grower has sized the root ball large enough for the canopy. And there are industry standard guidelines that dictate how much root ball has to be retained on certain canopy sizes or trunk diameters. These are expensive. These are the most expensive ways typically to buy woody plants because usually they're larger, so they've been in the nursery longer, and because they require a lot of equipment and handling to get them out of the ground, package them up, and ship them somewhere because they're heavy. But they have some instant gratification, and because of their weight, they're difficult to plant. So, question here in the classroom. At Glover? Oh no, I've been to Glover many times, and there's not very much balled and burlapped at Glover. Yeah, in the back. Now, the larger trees in the back, yeah, but all the stuff that people filter through when they come off the street, that's pretty much all container stock. If you can move it and pick it up without a forklift, it's probably not balled and burlapped. So the harvesting equipment that they use for this, there's different sizes. Some of them are mounted on the back of semi trucks and bigger tractors than this. This is a moderately sized unit here, but this is the tree spade. They call it a tree spade. So these are balled and burlapped, are field grown trees. You can see the rows of trees there. And they drive these tractors out with these tree spades on them. And there's a swinging door in the front. And then they maneuver the tree into the center, or they maneuver the equipment around where the tree is in the center of that opening. And then they close a little door in the front, and there's 4 hydraulic rams. And at the bottom of each one of those rams is a shovel that when all complete, when they're all pushed down, it forms a bowl, forms a pot. So they drive each one of those shovels down in there. And so this particular picture is showing all 4 hydraulic rams are down into the ground. And so that tree has been dug, so to speak. So all of the roots that are spread out into the soil around, if you're standing anywhere nearby, you'll feel them pop. You'll feel the little earthquakes as those roots get cut. And it's kind of heartbreaking, actually. Then they lift it up, and underneath it, they'll set a burlap sack with a wire, usually on the ground underneath it. They set it on the sack, pull the sack up, tie it around the top, and then they tie the wire around it as well. So that wire basket holds the soil together while the burlap really kind of protects the soil from moisture loss, really. And those are heavy. Like a tree like that with moist soil on it, which it should have, that's probably over 300 pounds. So it's pretty difficult for most people to deal with that. You're not going to get that in the back of your Subaru. But I don't know, you might get it on top of your car like in Christmas Vacation, right? So then they just move on to the next tree. So it's pretty labor intensive. You can see it takes a crew to do this. It's definitely something they have to plan for. Bare root plants are typically available to consumers directly in the early spring, February through April. And for most of us, we start to see these in the stores about now, maybe coming up in April, March for sure. What are the kinds of plants that we see bare root in the stores? Roses, small fruit trees, berries, some bushes like forsythia, some spireas and lilacs, a few, but it's pretty limited, right? Some fruit trees. And they're all dormant. And they're usually packed in a bag that has wood chips in it or sawdust, and it's wet. So the cost per plant on these is much, much cheaper because they haven't been growing in the nursery as long. They're smaller in most cases, a lot smaller. And because they can probably put 100,000 of these on one truck, the shipping cost per plant is really, really low compared to balled and burlap, where they might be able to get 40 on a truck, right? So, and they're pretty easy to plant because most of the root system has been removed. So the picture on with all the roots here, the grapes in the wheelbarrow, that's bare root grape plants that came dug from the nursery, and you can see how big that root spread is, small plants. And in a lot of cases, we won't dig a hole quite that big. We'll end up trimming the roots we'll dig a hole and we'll end up trimming the roots to be able to fit into the hole. So there's a little bit of both, digging the right hole, but also trimming the roots a little bit. But you can see that the other picture here, that he's got a bare root tree that was just dug from the ground. So a lot of times then these are also field grown, but instead of going and taking out a load of soil with it, they just pull the whole thing out of the ground. Well, there's a machine that actually cuts it off. So you can see the longer roots, those striker roots that are going down at these like 45-degree angles, they've been cut off about 18 inches down below where the soil line was. And then the worker is trimming those off more, and they're going to get potted up into those buckets in the back. And then at a nursery that's going to sell those on, which is what's happening here, they brought these in off a truck, bare root from a wholesale nursery, say in Washington. They're potting them up in these big, like 30-gallon, 25-gallon buckets. And then they're going to grow those for 1 to 2 years for the root systems to fill out in those pots. Because legally, they really aren't supposed to sell them until they can sell them bare root, or they can sell them as container stock, but the container stock needs to be established in the container. So they can sell them unestablished, but they're supposed to tag it that it's not established container stock. So you know that basically it's probably been a recently planted bare root. And if you pull it out, you'll probably set it back really far because it probably has started to root out and you really damage it. So try to avoid those if you see those. I've seen them before that have a little red tag on them that says, you know, non-established container stock, but that's what it means. It hasn't been in that pot very long. And then containers provide the most availability. It's typically year-round, and variety of sizes and prices. A lot of times too, what we see with containers is they'll put small bare root stuff in a container and kind of grow it as a container, but really the pot just becomes a method of being able to move it around and kind of hold the root ball a little bit together, but essentially it's bare root inside a container. Because you may have bought one and you pull it out of there and it's covered with burlap, and you know it's all the same. It's just within this other container so they can move it around and have it stand upright without tipping over. In containers, one thing that happens in containers is as the roots hit the side of the containers, they will start to follow and chase that edge. And that's normal. Roots are always moving. We talked about this like in the first class. Roots are always growing and developing because they have to explore new soil constantly to get water and nutrients out of it. So the result of that some of those roots then as they circle the container will get thick and supportive because the tree has to build a structure to hold it in the ground. And so you can see in the lower right picture that some of those roots were selected to get woody, and they really then kind of function a lot like branches or grow a lot like branches. But you can see that they were circling around there, and as they start to get bigger in diameter, they start to close each other off, and eventually they'll start to girdle the stem, which is what was happening in this case here. And basically it's like leaving a rope on the tree. So it cuts the food, ultimately what it does is it cuts the food supply off to the root system, and it can cut water supply off to the leaves. And so plants like this usually are a failure to thrive, or they'll tip over in the landscape. So when we pull it out, you can see the roots did escape from the planting hole just fine, but those circling roots around there are strangling it. Yeah, exactly. And then the other issue that we run into with container plants is, and we can get this with all plants, whether it's bare root or burlap, is planting them too deep. So you can see in the upper right picture, That's an example of a tree in a container that's planted too deep. In the container, it's too deep. So when we get it home, how likely is somebody going to be to plant it at that same level or even deeper? Pretty likely, almost always. Well, the reason this happens at the nursery, so this planting it too deep in containers is as much a nursery problem as it is as an end user problem. But what happens is if we go from a small container to a larger container, usually what's done is they just take it out of the smaller container, drop the whole root ball in. Those new containers are deeper as well as wider. They just set them on the bottom, fill the rest in with potting soil and top it off. So woody plants, generally speaking, cannot handle being deeper in the landscape or even in the pot than where the tree originally put out the roots. It's devastating. And a lot of people just cannot grasp this concept. Roots cannot adjust very well to that soil depth. So there's something we can do, and it's pretty easy. And to eliminate both of these problems is just being aware of it and then having the confidence to do something about it. Because the remedies are actually pretty simple. But it's kind of like pruning. You just have to do it and don't worry about it. For the one on the picture on the left where the roots are circling, I take an old pruning saw and I cut from the edge almost all the way to the center of that root ball in like at least 3 places, thirds around it. So any circling root that came out and hit the edge of the pot is only going to be a third of the diameter of that pot, right? So the chances of it actually getting big enough to cause strangulation is pretty low because it's not intact all the way around. And also from those cut ends, new branch roots will develop and they will go straight out from the root ball. So they'll move right into the new soil straight out. They won't stay in a circling pattern at all. Question?
The bottom picture I can see why it hasn't planted deep enough, but looking at the top one, how do we know it's planted?
Yeah, we'll get to there. How do we know it's planted too deep? Yep, we'll definitely get there because this is a super important topic. So the one on the bottom right is not salvageable. Yeah, if we were to go in and cut it, because it's been planted in the landscape for a couple of years at least. If we go in at this point and remove all those, it's moved all the feeder roots out, way out. And so we're gonna cause too much trauma to that. I don't think there's any saving that. Clarification.
That's the middle of the one on the left. Oh, not just on the outside.
Yeah, it's not superficial. It's not just on the outside. We go deep inside because most likely that plant has been in 1 or 2 pot sizes prior to this one, and there will be more than 1 layer of circling roots in there.
Go all the way where the trunks is.
Yeah, all the way up close to the trunk. So I'll cut more out of the bottom. I'll cut deeper into the bottom half than I do right at the top because I don't want to damage the root and stem interface. We call that the root flare. I don't want to damage the root flare. I don't want to actually cut the root flare. But this will make more sense. Hold your questions because this will make more sense as we get a little farther into the discussion, and I think it will answer your questions. What?
Like the next picture.
Yeah, like the next picture, right? So we talk about disturbing the root balls. And so here we have a juniper. I promise you that this juniper was in probably a number 1 pot long before it was in this number 5, and probably also in a number 2 before that. So the pot that we're seeing now, the root ball we're seeing now, is probably three pots old. Does that make sense? And you can pretty well bet that the roots would have done these circling layers at every point. So there's probably 3 layers of circling roots in there. So if we just do the superficial one, that's actually the one that will cause us the least amount of problems or well, the problems will be the farthest away than the ones that are closer to the middle where they're going to girdle at first. So that's why we have to cut in there pretty deep. And I've had landscapers argue with me about this. And the problem is, and they're not right. I promise you they're not right, because the research absolutely 100% backs this up. Well, we can pull them out of the ground and I can show you pictures of it. They argue with me about it because I think it's going to hurt the root system. It doesn't. The trees adjust. Yeah, you'll see the girdling, those circling roots. Yep. Yep, exactly. And they won't do it. But because landscapers, how long are they going to be working on that landscape, especially if it's just an install? 2 weeks maybe, and they're gone. If they guarantee it for a year, guess what? These kind of problems, they take longer than a year. If they come back in 3 or 5 years, then they're going to see these problems. But nobody's ever on the hook that long. So they dig everything with a backhoe, throw it in the ground, backfill it. They're gone. The trees struggle for 3 or 4 years. They don't thrive. They have a few leaves on them. They go out there, oh, they're still alive. Boom, we're off the hook. And then the city's ripping them out. I mean, I see this happen on my very street. A cycling thing. Every 5 years, they come and redo the landscape and put new trees in, and they never change anything else. And it's just like, what the crap are you spending my taxpayer dollars on this for? So question. Yeah, and that's a good point. I was going to say that at the very beginning. All of this applies to any woody plant. Doesn't matter if it's a fruit tree or not. What? So with the pruning saw, sometimes I will use pruning shears, like old shears, and I'll just cut all the way. I cut all the way to the center. I'll sometimes take the saw, I'll tip it over like this, and you can see the plus arrows on the bottom. I'll take the saw and I will cut all the way up to just below the soil surface and basically flay it out, just cut it in half. So the root ball, you can just take it into 2 pieces almost. Yeah, it sounds pretty dramatic, right?
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Then why, if they're struggling with this root circling, why don't people that grow these things just put a small plant in a great big container?
Because it doesn't really matter. The roots will always go to the edge of the container.
Well, that's true, but why move the plant from a 2-inch up to a 4-inch and then up to an 8-inch? Why don't they just put it in the 8-inch pot when it's really small?
Well, yeah, the industry doesn't work that way, unfortunately, because of space requirements mostly. They're able to pack more plants in, and putting a small plant in a really big pot. Sometimes that causes other problems like root rot issues because the soil will stay too wet for an extended period of time, where the plant isn't taking that up. So the way that growers have tried to address that problem is using different types of pots. So they do make pots that will eliminate this or reduce it greatly, that have, I don't know, Tom maybe can jump in here. They basically have holes along the sides. The sides are perforated, and they kind of have these dimples in them so that the roots will actually follow the dimples, and then they'll grow out of the root ball and into the air, and then they get air pruned, they call it, because the root tip will die in the air. And so the roots never circle because they're always directed to the outside of the pot where then they're air pruned. They're really expensive pots, so most growers won't do them, and they're a lot harder to transplant from because the roots tend to embed themselves around those openings, and you have to cut the pot off and peel it off. And so there's lots of challenges why the industry hasn't adopted. They're available, but widespread the industry hasn't adopted them. They have root pruning bags, which are basically these big heavy felt bags that do the same thing. The roots will go through the bag, and then they'll air prune, and then as the root starts to get fatter, it can't stretch the fabric very far, and so then the fabric just cuts it off. And so they're out there. They're just way more expensive than a basic plastic pot. and everybody's under economic constraints to grow things as inexpensively as possible so they can stay profitable. So there are things out there that growers can use. It just is a matter of economics to get them to use it. So I did a little bit of work with this in graduate school where we were kind of investigating these heavy felt bags, these root pruning bags, and they work really well, but they are so difficult when it comes time for planting because the roots are so embedded in that felt that you have to have a knife and you literally have to cut the felt off all the way around. So you've got this big containerized tree that you're rolling around on the ground trying to unzip this felt bag off of. And so the consumers don't like that. They're not going to want to work with that. It's good for the plant, but people won't buy it. They don't want to work with it. Right. But then when they see what they got to do here, it might be worth it, right? So don't be afraid to cut in there substantially because unless it's a very, very small plant, it's probably been through several sizes and will have circling roots and a plate of roots at each different bottom of whatever those pots were before. Question?
Especially about making 3 cuts versus 4.
No, 3 or 4, just as a matter of, hey, I don't want to spend more time on it than this. Some of them I've just simply cut in half, especially if it's a bigger one and I'm rolling it around and I'm losing potting soil and stuff. I just cut it in half and stick it in the pot or stick it in the hole. The point is just disturb it and disturb it substantially to get into those layers inside, okay? How often do we see this? Almost every single time. Everywhere. There's really never not seen. So the only time we wouldn't see that is if it was a newly transplanted, if it was basically non-established container stock, like from bare root, that's when we wouldn't see it. And if you tried to transplant those, you basically will lose all the soil anyway. So you have a bare root plant. We'll talk more about that depth. That's coming up on its own topic. So early spring and fall are usually the best times to plant because the cooler weather helps reduce transplant shock. If I could pick just one season, it would be fall. Fall is really the best. The problem is that most of us aren't keyed into planting things in the fall, and nurseries stop carrying stuff because people aren't buying in the fall. But really, it's probably the best time. It's the least stressful. We go into our period where there's a lot of root development that happens in the fall, so they'll still establish while they're transitioning into the dormant season, and our soil moisture levels usually go up substantially during the wintertime, and so that helps a lot. So I want to talk about planting steps. We'll talk about digging the hole and staking it and watering it in turn, but this is a simple diagram of what a planting hole should look like. Now, somebody asked about was it the little tree pruning book when we talked about that a couple class periods ago? If you're following that book, she has a lot of great information in there. She has a diagram very similar to this in there. And so that's spot on. So if you're looking at some of those things, you'll know it's pretty good information if they're kind of using these kind of things. It's a wide, shallow hole. So basically the hole is dug in and the plant itself is sitting in undisturbed soil. So this is why I was like, don't use a backhoe to dig, or if you do, don't make the whole hole out of a backhoe because they tend to over excavate and then they set it in there and then they backfill and everything's too deep. And the soil tends to settle too. If it's disturbed soil, it will tend to settle, and then you plant it at the right level, and then now it's deeper than that and water will collect at the base of that, and then you can have more root rot issues too. So, yeah, we'll talk about balled and burlap on its own. So,
hey, Mike.
Yeah, Justin.
This, just in general, this is a one good reason why it's important to know where that root flare is, because you may discover you only have to dig a 1 foot hole instead of a 2 or 3 foot hole.
Exactly. So we'll talk about, I'll talk about root flares, but you bring up a good point. And so remind me if we don't get back to coming back around to that point. So we have the root ball sitting on undisturbed soil. You can see that the hole was dug wide, like 3 times the diameter of the pot wide. And then we backfill with the dirt we took out of the hole. The research is very, very strong on this, that it's detrimental to add a bunch of organic matter to that soil. And it's even worse if you use just potting soil or something like that, because that's not what the plant is going to have to grow in long term. And we'll talk about this more, but look at where the roots are going. Notice, and this illustration is pretty accurate as to where woody plants put their roots. How many roots do you see in the next year or so have gone straight down? None. And that's pretty typical, not very many. The roots go out away from the plant very horizontally and very close to the surface. And the reason that we're just digging out the sides there, that's really to loosen compaction. So the roots can move easily away from the root ball in the native soil. So they're getting used to that they're going to have to grow in the rest of their life. But at least they're getting established and can start taking water and nutrients up out of that native soil. And then if it's more compacted farther out, then the roots can deal with that. And you can see they do start to put these kind of striker roots down deeper into that undisturbed soil, but that takes longer. So no soil PEP, no soil amendments. This will save you money. This will save you time. It'll save you from the soil settling and your plant sinking into the ground, because what happens to all those organic materials? They break down, they're going to leave voids in the soil is going to collapse. So start out with what the plant is going to have to grow in long term. We talk about a woody plant, it's probably, I mean, really they may have decades of life cycle left. Those roots aren't staying in that hole, and it's not doing them any service to baby them at this point. Yeah. Yeah. So what I hope you'll take away from the Master Gardener class is that most of the products that are being sold in the garden centers are simply unnecessary, completely unnecessary. And in a lot of cases, they can actually work against you because they're not best management practices. If you can just nail the best management practices, pick a good tree for the spot, the location, and plant it right, you've solved most of the problem right there. Literally, we do. A lot of times when we go to landscapes to look at problems, almost all the time when it's a woody plant, almost everything is planted too deep. And guess what happens? Root rot, stem rot. And when do we start seeing that? 10 or 15 years later. So the previous homeowner or 2 homeowners ago, or the previous arborist. So, all right. So Justin brought this up, and I have a huge section on this, root flare. This is the transition point from the stem of the woody plant to the root system of the woody plant. And we start to see that buttress, which has to support the tipping over potential and also the weight of that tree or shrub pushing down on it. Think about a skyscraper, how it has this deep foundation. Plants build that foundation. Woody plants build that foundation as they go along. And eventually, if the tree gets big enough, those roots become very thickened with lots of secondary growth. They become like branches in size, and they start to stick up above the lawn. And then that ticks people off, and they want to cut them off, or they want to bury them deeper. And none of those are correct, because if a tree gets big enough, it will do that. And that is the normal, natural buttress development cycle to keep it from tipping over. It will always continually be building those roots and thickening those and strengthening those to keep the plant from tipping over. And there's anything you're going to be able to do about it. If you bury it deeper, we'll talk about that. That's a problem. If you cut them off, well, certainly that's a problem, right? So this is what we're looking for, is this root flare. So if we look on a tree that was maybe started from a cutting, okay, we may not see that swelling or that widening at the base, that flaring at the base. So this is actually a container plant that was bare rooted. And I think it was Ed Gilman, he's retired now, but was University of Florida, who his whole career was spent on research on root development of trees and thinking about how trees respond to hurricanes and these cool experiments where they brought these big fans in and tried to blow trees out of the ground and stuff. But I think it was him that said at a conference I heard him talk at that he bare roots all of his container stuff so that he can untangle the huge amount of problems that occur with root systems in containerized plants. Well, it's not okay here in the summer, right? But, okay, so there is no root flare really on this, okay? It's not old enough to have had one. It's probably started from a cutting, or at least the rootstock was. So you can look and see, and this is an example of a tree that was actually dug up because it was planted too deep. So where the person is holding his hand up the top, that's where the soil level was. Okay, that's actually above the graft. You can see there's a graft there, right, at the bottom of his finger, his pointer finger. The other worker's hand at the left is where the soil level should be. So can you discern where the soil level needs to be? Where do the roots start coming off of that stem? And it is starting to buttress out a little bit. That's the root flare. So that is just buried. That's just barely buried at where those roots are. And if you're going to make a mistake on planting depth, plant them too high. Leave roots exposed, no big deal. That's way less of a big deal than burying them too deep. So when in doubt, plant high. All right, so there's the artificial soil line there. Well, actually, yeah, it was actually even higher. You can see the staining on it. You can see the graft union and where the actual root flare was. So we're talking about a plant that was like 8 inches too deep. And does that cause problems? Yeah, but not the first year. You won't see it for a few years. Why are these trees not as big as the other ones that were planted higher? So Max Darrington, who was arborist at BYU, I'm not sure if he's still there. He ran his own consulting arborist company for a lot of years too. I was talking to him one day. I used to take classes down and have him talk about tree canopy management and stuff. He was telling me that at the Provo LDS Temple, he said they're losing all the maple trees planted along the walkway on the west side of the temple. And he said they're all planted too deep, and it was all done long before he came on board as an arborist. And he said, but I'm dealing with the dieback and the death of these trees and having to answer to like the church leaders as to why these are dying out. And he said, and they were planted 20 or 30 years ago, and we're just starting to have that consequence now. They're not as big as they should be. They're dying back. They've got root issues, stem problems, stem rot problems. And so that's a problem that somebody else will inherit, but short term, they don't establish or grow as fast either. So you will lose some benefit short term, even if you're, say, only in the property for a few years. Those trees aren't going to perform during that period like they should. And it's devastating to fruit trees, especially stone fruits. Stone fruits have no tolerance for this at all, for planting too deep. They're so sensitive to soil, to poor draining soil anyway. This makes it worse. So here's a picture from Ed Gilman, some of the work that he did. So you can see here, they planted this tree in a hole, and they didn't dig a wide hole. They just dug the hole just as wide as the pot was, and they stuck it in the ground. And you can see that most of the roots actually stayed and moved inside the hole in the ground like they were in a pot because of the compaction, the compacted soil. And the roots that did escape, you can see the blue arrows, or the blue arrow at the top, and you can see some in the lower right corner and on the far left. Some roots did escape the planting hole, but they grew in the mulch on top of the soil surface. They didn't grow through the soil at all because of compaction. So it's a big deal. That's why we say dig a wider hole so those roots can start to immediately move away and start to penetrate into various places in the native soil. Yeah, you can go wider in heavy clay. Yeah, for sure. Yep.
So they died. We pulled them out and they were just like they were in a pot.
Yeah. So the heavier the soil, the more compacted it is, the wider you can go. And you don't necessarily have to dig the whole hole. Arborists have a technique too with large trees and really compacted soil where they do, it's like radial trenching, where they'll rent like a sprinkler trencher And they'll go up close to the base, and then they'll just dig a trench straight out. And they'll do that every so often, so the roots can actually follow those channels, and they'll fill those in with soil. Because if they do that to the whole yard, they've dug up all the roots, the tree's going to die. But doing these radial cut outs like spokes on a wheel is very minimal damage to the root system, but it gives the roots, once they find that channel, a place to congregate. So that's another option, is you don't have to do the whole thing. You can just do areas to focus the growth in. Staking is usually not required. So we see this in commercial landscapes where the architect or whatever is always going to require it. It's not necessary in most of the cases. It's just absolutely not necessary. And in a lot of cases, it's detrimental to do it. It's usually only needed on ball and burlap conifers and small nursery stock that was planted too closely at the nursery and it can't stand up on its own. I did have a neighbor that bought a cheap tree, and when he stuck it in the ground, the whole thing just flopped over. It was a little maple tree. And so we staked it up, and a year later, it didn't need the stake anymore. And that's like exactly the way it should be. So here's an example of staking that is crazy. So here we have a nice tree, and they a lot of times will come with these like 1.5 or 2-inch wooden dowels taped to them. Okay, that's a shipping aid to help keep the trunk from being damaged during shipping. They shouldn't be left on after they're planted. They should be removed, but I've never seen a landscaper take them off. I've collected them before just because I'm like, hey, I need some wooden stakes. And then they added to that some rebar, and then the T-posts with the wire to hold it sturdy. And then, but they did put some pipe around it to help keep the tree from being damaged. But then they put wire tie on there and it's damaging the tree anyway. And so it's like, well, I guess if they're worried about trees being stolen, but what the hell were they thinking? So I want you to notice here, look at the taper of the trunk from the top to the bottom. How much difference is there in taper? There is none, right? Minimal. So what happens at this point? So what that tells me is that those stakes have been on there a while, because the tree now is being supported by those. It's not putting energy into developing a buttress at the bottom, like a fishing rod gets fatter the closer you get to the handle, same idea. So if we take those stakes off, what's going to happen? First windstorm, snap. It will break. So I actually worked with a church property where this very thing was happening. And there's a way to go about it where you can save the trees. You have to wean them off of this gradually and allow the trunk to move. Not enough that it can break, but enough that it will start to feel the effect of the wind and start to build those. And then usually within a couple of years, you can take the stakes off completely after that point, right? So something that allows the plant to still move, it doesn't have to move very much and it will develop that taper. It doesn't have to blow like halfway over. It just has to move when the wind blows, and that's enough. There's lots and lots of methods to do this. You can buy special rubbery kits that do this with rubber strings and things. It doesn't really matter. And in this case, we have a young nursery plant here that has a hard time standing up on its own, and so the stake is necessary to help it. But after the first growing season, usually then everything like that can be removed. Question?
If you were to inherit a property though, where the tree is leaning.
Okay, yeah, if the tree's leaning, you own that leaning tree, and that's always how it's going to be. No, you can't straighten it. Nope. I mean, you could with a backhoe or something big, but you're not going to move it unless it's a very small tree. And if it's leaning because of the wind, there isn't any long-term help for you. You just move, find a place where the wind doesn't blow that direction. If it was planted that way because of poor planting practices and it's not been very long, you can probably dig down and sever some of the roots and tip it back up and then replant it. And you may need to stake it for a season, since it will maybe not have all the roots on one side or something. But usually within a season, it's put enough back out there that you can take the staking off. So overwatering is a big deal. It kills more trees than any other problems. We just see this so much. Usually young trees need 1 to 2 inches of water per week for the first year. And honestly, most trees need that in our climate ongoing anyway, unless they're really drought tolerant trees. But the trick on young trees is, where does that 1 to 2 inches of water need to be put? Right at the base, right where that root ball is, right? The first year, the roots are just moving out of that root ball. They're not going to go very far, most likely, out of that. So if you're watering that area right, in this case, right where the mulch is, that's the target area. And it'll move out into the grass, certainly. Question?
Challenging with determining how much water. There's like many different ways to measure water. So like
Oh.
2 inches or so many gallons.
Yeah,
Or my sprinklers have like flow rates, or
yeah.
or you put the water sensor in there and it's
Okay, water sensors are complete crap. Don't use them.
so like, but between all of these, like how
So sprinkler flow rates, unless you have that, they're pretty much junk, because they're gonna give you a flow rate for the whole zone. So unless you have a way to translate that out to the area that the plant is in, or can convert it into inches, which is what almost all the recommendations are going to be on, is inches of water, because that's how precipitation is measured, and sprinklers are just rain. So that's the standard. So and that's why we say inches. Now, if you have drip irrigation, there's formulas that help you convert gallons per hour into inches per hour. No problem. We can do that. Easy. Yeah. And we'll talk that in irrigation. Well, at the last class. Yeah, we'll talk all about in the irrigation and measuring how much rain your sprinklers are putting out. Mulch can be good. Mulching around the base of the tree. If you want to do that, in this case here, the mulch is actually too close to the base of the tree. We actually really don't want the mulch to touch the base of the tree, because mulch tends to hold a lot of water. And really, it's kind of like burying it too deep. We tend to see stem rot there, or right around the graft if the mulch is thick and heavy right up there. So just leave a small gap where the mulch isn't right up crowding the base. And then site selection. Sometimes sites just aren't very suitable to growing plants. So here we've had a rainstorm. The holes they dug for those trees, they're nice and wide, certainly, but that may not drain. Now, if that much water drains in a 24-hour period, we're probably okay. But it's going to be pretty soggy for a while. Right? It looks pretty rough. So, and this is pretty typical of landscape situations, because all of this has been driven on so much, and then a lot of times they'll add soil on top of it. Sometimes they drive on that, sometimes not as much, but you end up with these layers of different compaction. And it's just hard for plants to work in that. Fertilizers in trees, fertilizers at planting, don't do it. And then a lot of times woody plants really don't need it. But the bigger the tree, the longer you wait until you put fertilizer on it specifically. And the reason for that is we want root development. We don't want a lot of shoot development. Nitrogen stimulates shoot development. So we just avoid it. Because we can stimulate a lot of shoot development that then comes at the expense of roots. And plants will build the root system. Woody plants especially will build a root system long before you see. I planted a little oak tree years ago in my first house. Well, my first house in Utah. It was a new build, and I planted a little English oak. And for about 3 years, the tree really didn't get any bigger in size. But after 3 years, I noticed that it had pushed away. I put this little cement ring around there, which is also stupid. But I put this little cement, and I noticed that it had been lifted up slightly. And I looked down, I could see a root that was about 1 inch big. And I actually followed that root. I could see it actually in the grass right at the surface. I followed it like 15 feet all the way to my garden. So this little tree had put so much energy into root development. It had gone throughout almost the whole backyard before the top of the tree had really done anything. And then the next year, the top took off. It grew like 3 feet the next year, because it had reestablished its foundation, and then it had the resources then to take off. So that happens. So functionally, this is what we're talking about. We have the crown, the trunk, and then we have the root collar, root flare. So the root flare is the buttressing. The root collar is more where the layers of bark overlap each other and they're in that same area, so you can see that. But this big old poplar tree, you can see that root flare is really nice. It's got roots coming up in the grass all over the place. The tree's happy with it, that they mow the lawn high enough that there wasn't that much root damage, and that's just the way it should be. So with root systems, a lot of times we get hung up talking about woody plants having tap roots. They don't. In our case, they don't worry about it. They don't exist. A woody plant will have a tap root, and maybe not even for its whole life. Usually not. Usually more of an establishment protocol. If you planted it from seed in your yard, it will develop a tap root. If you have a container plant, ball and burlapped, bare root, if there ever was a tap root, it was removed when it was harvested, and it doesn't grow back. So don't worry about it. The roots aren't ever really going to be that deep. Some of the native plants do strongly depend on that root system, and sometimes disturbing it can make it really difficult to get them to establish when you've transplanted them somewhere else. But again, it's going to be for seed started stuff. Fibrous roots are mostly what we're talking about, the lateral roots that move near the soil surface. Most of them are going to be in the top 3 feet, and really it's more like 80% of them are in the top foot. So roots on woody plants aren't going as most of us are taught to believe from an early age. And the root systems are much wider than the plant canopy. So here's another picture from Ed Gilman kind of showing this. So they exposed about a 6-foot long section out from the base of this tree. And you can see the root flare right at the soil line beginning to swell in normal fashion. And the long roots are growing only in the upper soil layers, and they're going way out away from the tree. And notice how you can tell that a lot of these roots that are moving out there have hit an obstacle and gone around it. And then they resume that same direction they were before, which is getting away from the center of the plant as fast as possible. Their job is to spread out into the neighboring soil like spokes on a wheel, and they do that pretty readily.
Are we gonna talk about transplanting?
We'll talk about transplanting. Well, I mean, a lot of this is talking about transplanting already. So another Ed Gilman thing, this is just showing you that these red maples here on the left, you can kind of see the very left is the center of the tree. They've been in the ground 2 years in Florida, so much longer growing season and easier growing conditions for these. But in 2 years, the root system has moved out to where he's standing. And they painted them white. It's hard to see them, but they painted some of those roots white. And on this one here, these oaks have been in the ground in a year, and the root system is growing to where those people are standing. And you can kind of see on the left, there's a painted root, and it's only a few inches from the surface. So 1 year. And it's already past the drip line, what we call the drip line. Okay, the drip line, people say, oh, fertilize to the drip line, that's BS. Because the roots on woody plants usually extend way, way, way beyond the drip line. So it's a convenient thing for people to use as a reference point. But that's not where they're taking up all their water and nutrients, for sure not. All right, so roots commonly extend as far as 2 to 3 times the diameter of the drip line. I've seen some research where they've looked at larger trees in shared canopies and things where the roots have been spreading out more than 10 times the diameter of the drip line. So they really take off and go through the field. So that means that if a tree crown is 10 feet wide, the roots can be found out to about 20 or 30 feet and sometimes farther. That's in each direction. So if you have a big tree, the roots are in all of the neighbors' yards on that street, most likely. And then the road coming up under the sidewalk, maybe, right? So in this scene here, the roots of these young maple trees will probably grow laterally and fill that whole section of turf within a few years and intermingled with the turf. And they have to compete with the turf. They have to get oxygen. So they're not going to be that much deeper than the turf roots, if any. They're going to be right there competing. with the grass. They don't go down. Why? What is the benefit of a root system being really deep? Yeah, there's less oxygen and less water, especially in our climate. Now, we do find some drought, like some desert plants that can be rooted very, very deeply, but they are following a wet path. They're not seeking water out of dry soil. That is complete falsehood. Plant roots do not seek water. They follow wet channels in soil because they can't move through dry soil. It kills the roots when they try to move through dry soil. It kills the root tip. Question?
That's in the turf. You just talked about everything around it is getting watered.
Yeah, if you have trees growing near the lawn, they're getting what the lawn's getting. That's their watering program, period. So if you're watering your lawn deeply, which you should be anyway, so the water is penetrating 12 inches or so, and you can easily have lawn roots that deep. I've grown lawn in clay loam soils, and I go down with a soil probe and I break roots off at 12 inches. So I know they'll go that deep, even in heavy soils, if you water it deeply enough and let it dry out enough between irrigations. And the tree roots can do that. They can be there too. And so we can influence tree depth, root depth a little bit by irrigation practices. But it's not as much as most of us think, especially if we're watering reasonably, responsibly, in that we're putting on what it needs and letting it go deep, but we're not flooding it, keeping it squishy and all those kinds of things. Because in that sense, then the roots will be really right on top. So another one from Ed Gilman. So this is a pittosporum shrub, which is growing in sandy soil, which is most of Florida. And you can see that in this very well draining soil with large pore spaces where they get lots of moisture, almost all of the root systems of this woody plant were in the top 8 inches. When they had every opportunity to be a lot deeper than that, the plant simply did not put resources into those deeper roots because the best oxygen, the best soil microbial activity, the best nutrient turnover, the best nutrient availability, and the most water is available near the surface. So it just doesn't make sense to put roots deeper than that and then really never get that water. All right, questions? Okay.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah. Go ahead, Justin.
So Jeremy asked a really good question in the chat, and he can jump in here to clarify if he needs to, but in a situation where the drainage is awful, will it help if you put in a large raised bed and then plant the tree at the appropriate depth to shed the water away from the tree?
Not long term. Not long term, no. Planting large woody plants in raised beds is usually not a good approach for woody plants because it makes them more prone to tipping over because they can't really establish into the other soil as well. But long term, those roots aren't going to stay in that bed. So it's better just to try and have the whole the planting area good, and then it's water management after that.
Irrigation for, mature trees, if you're doing more towards a xeriscape, where you're putting in more hardscape, gravel, mulch.
Yeah, so we can talk about that in the irrigation class, but like if you're taking out all your turf, but you want to keep your trees alive, we've worked with this on worked with some of the cities on this and in the parks, and yeah, it kills the trees. It kills the trees unless they leave the irrigation systems in place.
You could just run it like you did, just as a drip instead of a spring.
Well, if you're gonna run it as a drip, you can't just put one ring around the base of the tree. Yeah.
Didn't have turf grass, instead of having pop-ups, you could just.
Yeah, you can do drip. Kind of. We'll talk about that in the irrigation class. So, all right.
It's like trees, like a willow or.
Yeah, trees that are weaker, like they're not structurally sound. Yeah.
Because the roots are at the surface, because it sounds like most roots are at the.
Yeah, most roots are surface. It's genetically these trees are weak trees. So they're fast growing trees. Fast growing trees don't invest long term. So their wood is structurally softer.
So, yeah.
It's a matter of genetics and species. It's not the roots. No. All right, so planting too deep. We talked about that already. Depletes the root system from oxygen, promotes trunk decay and root rot organisms. Here's another example of this tree. So you can see the root flare now, right? Because the potting soil on this one was excavated down about 6 inches from where it had been planted before. Okay, so that will probably save that tree. Here's a landscape tree. You can see it looks like a post going into the ground, right? If you don't see a root flare, it's planted too deep. And I can go around to every tree in a landscape and I can tell you in a second if it's planted too deep or not. Another good evidence of that is you can see those, look at that big girdling root right there. In this case, we could probably clip that one off. It's not really structural at that point. We might be able to push that, but without excavating down. So down about where the tip of that shovel is, about 12 inches or so from the soil line, we start to find the root flare. And that, yeah, so that was planted too deep. Can we save that tree? Probably not. So unless you can excavate all that. I was at the New York Botanical Garden a number of years ago where they had built a building and backfilled around some trees, and they had actually they built the retaining wall in a circle around the trees out several feet, and then they backfilled up to that. And it was a stump in this pit because they tried to save the tree, but it still died because it's not just the base of the tree. It's think about how, now that you know kind of where the roots are going, how far out are the roots now having to deal with this planting issue. Here's a conifer. Now that was planted way too deep. You can see where the soil line was just to the right of where the shovel head is. And this tree actually broke off, but it broke off, it still wasn't at the root flare. So the balled and burlap. So probably planted with a backhoe, right? Or excavator equipment that dug a really deep hole. Devastating. Okay, the girdling roots kind of go along with it, but it's containers for too long. The trunk gets choked by the circling roots. It can take some years to see the problem. In this case too, we could probably eliminate that, but look at the damage that's already been done. You can see how hard it's been, like leaving a rope on the trunk on that right side. Grapes fall in the same. It's a woody plant. It's all the same. Yep. Here's some more. Clematis is absolutely a woody plant. Yep. Packing materials left on. So here's a string that was left on, and then it was, then it looks like it was buried. So you can see where the soil line was up above his thumb, right? So the string was buried. Nobody could see that. So this had multiple problems. But look at the swelling of the stem above where the string was. So that means all the carbohydrates that are being produced by the leaves that the roots needed hit this big accident on the highway and they couldn't get through. So traffic just backed up. It caused the tissue to swell because of all that. And so the root system, in this case, really starved to death before the stem rot or any root issues got to it, because it was actually still in the container at the nursery. Here's a balled and burlap. So you can see the burlap is left on. There's packing materials left on, failure to thrive. A good example to go in and look closer and see some problems like this. String trimmers. That's why we say build some sort of tree well around them. Don't let the grass or other plants right up near the base. Because if you can keep the lawn mowing equipment away, the string trimmers and stuff, you're not as good as you think you are, I promise, to get the little whiskers that come up right at the base of the tree. And winter sun injury. Tom talked about this, wrapping trees, painting trees white. You can see the split on that and the bleached bark. That's a ornamental plum. And they have a dark, thin bark. And when we get that warm winter sun that shines on them, that bark comes out of dormancy, then it will quickly refreeze again, and it kills the tissue underneath the bark on the southwest side of the tree. So we call it southwest winter injury as well. So in another year or so, that bark will start falling off, and there isn't any way no magic paint or anything that will fix that. So the tree will have that injury. It will probably cause it to have an early death and failure to thrive. if it's not too extensive, which this is very extensive, if you can keep the injury from happening in future years, the tree can, in a lot of cases, eventually close that back over and then start to, and it rebuilds that tissue. But here's some more winter sun injury. This is on I think this is an ornamental cherry, which is born for winter sun injury. And so this is a problem. This is not a problem countrywide, winter sun injury. It can be, but we see it a lot in our climate because we have high elevation, low humidity, and really intense sunlight. So you may not see them promoting this kind of thing so much if you live in Washington or along the coast or in more humid, cloudy, rainy climates, because they don't get the same kind of light levels that we get. It's tremendously brighter here because of our elevation and the fact that we have low humidity and, for the most part, pretty clean air. There's string trimmer damage. So we see this happening. It damages the bark, it kills the cambium, and that blocks the flow. It doesn't hurt the water flow. The water flow is below that. What it really hurts is the flow of sugar from between the leaves and the root system. And so what we find then is the root system kind of dies back to match what resources it can get. And then the canopy dies back to match that. So if you have a whole line of trees and one of them gets this injury, you'll notice after 5 or 10 years that the other trees are bigger than the one with the string trimmer injury, just simply because the tree has had to adjust to that. Mower blight, yep. Because you can clip bark off with the edge of a lawnmower or wheel of a lawnmower, just like you could with a string trimmer, right? Irrigation is tricky. We'll talk more about that on its own day. But too much water and too little water will cause the same symptoms, just for opposite reasons. On the one, there's just not water to take up. On the other one, there's so much water that it displaces all the oxygen in the soil and the root systems are suffocating. So they can't take up water. So we paddle out there in our canoe to look what's wrong and think that, oh, the tree's water stressed and put more water on it, or fertilize it and then put more water on it, none of which is going to help. For planting sites, trees and power lines. This is unfortunate. In the picture on the right, the trees were there first, and then the power lines were added, and that's directional pruning, and that's actually way better for the trees. It looks fine from the house. The tree looks okay from the house and looks okay from the street, except for that one angle. And also the power companies it's not as much work to them as well, and they don't have the regrowth. So they can maybe can go another year or two between pruning it again if they do this than if they just flat top them. But the tree on the left, that was added after the power lines were there, and so that's just poor tree selection right there. Right. Other tough choices here. Tree of Heaven, I think on the left, that was a seedling that they just didn't rogue out. That's probably going to cause problems. And then, what chance does a little honey locust have in a 2-foot wide growing strip that's going to get salt on it? This is in Logan on campus. And the parking lot also gets a lot of salt in the winter. So those trees aren't there anymore. And then topping trees. Don't ever use an arborist that says they'll do it. Go somewhere else. Even if you tell them not to do it, they obviously don't have the skills and the knowledge that they need to do a good job. Well, you look for an ISA certified arborist, and ideally it's the ISA certified arborist that's going to do the work, not just the supervisor that shows up maybe once, if at all. Yeah, so ISA is the International Society of Arboriculture. They have an amazing regulatory body and licensing. It's very, very rigorous. It's an excellent organization, and they're based, I think, in Sweden or Denmark, I forget. ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture. Yeah, I'll finish this. We'll take a break. So improper pruning is basically what this is. So you can see where this tree was topped. You can see where the big branch is in, and then you have this proliferation of small branches. So if the homeowner was concerned about the tree being too high, how well did topping the tree solve that problem? It didn't, because genetically the tree is going to be as big as the tree is going to be. And it grew back, but now they're all But even worse is all those branches are poorly attached because they came from buds right under the bark. So they're not connected deeply into the stem. They're only connected superficially on the outer edge of the stem. So when we get a storm, a lot of those fall off. Plus there's huge wounds that will never close. And so then you get decay that will move right down through the center on those. So topping is never the right answer. There are some situations, and a good arborist can evaluate a tree for this, where they can do what's called drop crotching, which is they actually look for natural growing points in the tree, and they will remove top material down to where those natural forks are, or those natural lower sections are, so that it doesn't completely disrupt the tree's natural tendency to want to be that tall. And they can lower a tree height that way, and it can be quite sustainable. I saw Darrington tree experts do this on a honey locust a few years ago, and maybe like 10 or more years ago, and the tree still looks great. They drop crossed it and it stayed lower, and it looks really, really good. So it can be done, not on every tree, but there are sustainable ways to look at it. But really the most sustainable way to look at this is what? That's the wrong tree for that space. That's a removal. They probably could have paid almost the same amount of money to have the tree just completely removed instead of paying to have it topped. And then put another smaller tree in its place that would better fit what their needs were, what their concerns were, right? That's the long-term strategy. The bottom line here, that in poor cultural practices leads to increased woody plant stress, and those trees are more susceptible to insect problems, diseases, and death. So most of the time when trees get borers, people call me and they say, well, can I spray on my tree? What can I drench my tree with? Probably nothing's going to help, because those problems are not the primary issue. Something else caused the tree to be stressed. Those things moved in there because the tree now has weakened defenses, and the tree is already in a downward spiral. By the time you see borers, the tree's already on its declining spiral, and you're probably not going to save it. So, and this is the hard thing too with woody plants, is you can have a nice looking plant that has been, that's had some injuries, or maybe is predisposed to injuries by pollution and herbicide damage, stresses the tree out. They'll start this declining spiral, and where we actually get visible injury, like dieback. And it's somewhere in that period between injured and decline that people notice that there's a problem with their landscape tree, right? But we're already, in a lot of cases, we're already many years into this declining spiral before we notice that there's a problem. And once trees hit the declining phase, it's done. It's done. There's no bringing them back. Because trees and woody plants generally, when I say trees, I mean woody plants generally, they spend a lot of energy building a foundation and building up structural wood to support themselves for decades. And it takes them a long time to get to that point, and it takes them a long time. When they start to die, they usually have a lot of resources. When they start to die, it takes them a while to show visible signs that they're having problems. By the time we see those problems, they're already so far advanced. It's kind of like cancer. A lot of times we don't know that we have it until it's already pretty far advanced, and then it's really difficult to try and do anything about it. And that's just the reality of it. And so it's hard for me to go to a landscape and look at a tree problem and tell somebody, there's nothing you can do for this tree. It's planted too deep. That predisposed it to these problems, right? Soil's compacted. You use a lot of de-icing salt. You use a lot of herbicides, right? We all have these things that can cause these problems. So the average life of a landscape woody plant is typically not very long. Only, I think on average, only about 10 years. But genetically, we have a plant that could live for 300 if the conditions were good for it, right?
Hey, Mike,
Go ahead.
it's really important that you stake your trees in the right direction. the literature from the ISA Arbor website and treesaregood.org mentioned that it is important that the trees be able to move and sway according to the prevailing winds so that they can adapt to those. So anyway, if you've got like a prevailing wind out of the south all the time, you should stake your tree on the east and west sides.
Yeah, so it can move from the south to the north.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Nope, that's a good point. There's a question in here about a peach tree that's about 20 years old and most of the main branches, the bark has died and flaked off the top side. So that's winter sun injury. Anything that's exposed directly to the sun. So those branches are just big enough and broadly exposed to the sun horizontally. So that's what happens. So there isn't anything to fix it. And long term, usually the peach trees seem to be pretty tolerant of that. And a lot of people go for years and still get good peaches off of trees that have that top bark that's dead on there. So that's up to you as to how long you're going to let it go. But you just kind of look and see when the whole thing starts to decline. Okay, so I wanted to make sure we covered landscape losers. We got 2 slides left, and then we'll have some time to start talking about individual trees, which is fun. So as a general rule, the trees in this group, we don't recommend planting. First of all, this is generally the category that is fast growing. Fast growing trees, they party fast. Like they're the partiers, so they burn out and they die fast. So that's the trade-off. They grow fast, but the wood is weak. You're going to have a messy tree, a lot of failures, and they tend to also have a lot of pest problems. So I know a lot of people are like, well, I really want fast-growing trees. There are some good long-lived trees that are faster growing. Some of the maples and even some of the oaks are pretty fast-growing, but have a lot more durable structure. So that's the willows, the poplars, quaking aspen. So quaking aspen is weak wooded, but it's a native to higher elevations, and doesn't make a fantastic landscape tree. It's usually quite stressed, and its natural habit is to grow suckers, right, from the underground stems. Well, it does that because really each individual stem doesn't live that long, 20 years or so, and a lot of them are dying out. And so it compensates for having these rather weak stems by just producing a lot of them all the time. Well, we tend to suppress the development of those in our yards. We mow them off, we cut them out, whatever. And then we don't give the tree a chance to replace itself in the grove like it likes to. So I actually wrote a fact sheet a few years ago about how to manage aspen trees in landscapes by letting selected suckers grow to replace. And then before the stem gets big enough, you actually go in and replace it when they're about 6 or 8 inch diameter. You cut them off and force the growth into those shoots. So you're always keeping younger, less disease prone stems. And the tree is less likely to want to go everywhere else because you're not suppressing all of its natural ability and desires, right? Green ash, and generally any of the ashes, so in southern Utah, any of like the Modesto ashes, any of those, we don't recommend any ash trees to be planted anymore. This does not mean mountain ash, which isn't true ash anyway, but these are the fraxinus species, and they've always been problematic. They always tend to have aphid problems, and they get the ash lilac borer, which can cause problems. The wood isn't particularly weak, but they do have quite a bit of dieback and branching that dies out and regrows over time. But it's the emerald ash borer issue now. And so we actually know of a lot of nurseries that simply aren't carrying ash at all anymore. And a lot of the nurseries aren't producing very much of it because of emerald ash borer, which is a disease that's introduced from Europe, but has been in the US for a long time back east. It's pretty much decimated all of the hardwood ash forests that are in the east. Now you can read about this. Huge timber losses, lots of what ash tree was used for, furniture and handles and other kinds of tools, is not available anymore because of this pest. We really can't stop it. So we can protect certain trees for a certain period of time, but it's not a forever thing. And we know that this pest is in Colorado because it was transported there on an illegal load of firewood. So this is one of the reasons why they say don't move firewood from one area to another, and this is why. So it's a matter of time before it gets to Utah. It may already be here. We haven't discovered it yet. We do have 2 native ash, Fraxinus ash species to our forests here. It will probably feed on those just fine like it has everything else. There's every indication that they have no problem feeding on the whole range of species of Fraxinus. Even though our ash trees are spaced farther apart, it will probably take them longer to decimate all of them, but it will probably happen. And so in landscapes, for a long time, ash was one of the predominant species used in landscapes, like up to 20% or more of landscape trees were ash trees. And so losing all those trees, if we do get this pest over a 10-year period, could be pretty devastating for our open spaces, our green spaces where that shade has been really desirable. Other trees will have to be planted and it's going to take time to rebalance that urban forest. So the pink flower, we'll get, that's black locust. That's the flower on black locust. That's a purple robe locust, which purple robe is a cultivar of black locust. Black locust, that's the only redeeming feature of this tree is those purple flowers. It's beautiful, but the wood is like sneeze on it, it falls out of the tree. It's very weak, it's very weedy, it's very prone to borers. It is a terrible landscape tree. Black locust grows wild in lots of places in the United States, and it does fine in the natural habitats where it can just disintegrate and regrow and form these thickets and things, but it does not make a good landscape tree. Tree of Heaven, you can't buy that one anymore, but we see a lot of them around, and the seedlings it kind of is like the weedy Siberian elm in its seed capacity. It fruits at a similar time, and the seeds blow on the wind, kind of the papery disc thing. And I don't know how it got the name Tree of Heaven, but it was probably a sarcastic name or something, because it is not, it's weak, it's very weedy and very prone to break. And Siberian elm, so I'm going to make the point here, this is not Chinese elm, okay? This is Ulmus pumila, which is a very weedy tree with weak growth, weak wood, and huge seed capacity, as we all know. It is not Chinese elm, which is lace bark elm is the other word for Chinese elm, and that's the one I like to say people, because, oh, that sounds nice. And it's a beautifully behaved tree. It makes a good landscape tree for Utah. It does produce seeds, but it doesn't produce them at the same time of year. And in all the areas that I've seen it, it does not have the seedling potential. So it's a great tree, but that's Chinese elm, which is Ulmus parvifolia, and not Siberian elm, which is Ulmus pumila. Russian olive, which is illegal to sell in Utah. It's on the noxious weed list, and you're not required to remove it if you have it in your landscape, but you're required to control it. So meaning you can't let it spread, and it will spread via suckers and by seed load. The bad thing about this one, it's really well adapted here, but there aren't any bird species that use it for cover. It just has no benefit to really the ecosystem at all. It uses a lot of water. And then blue spruce, and I put blue spruce here in with a question mark. So what a lot of people don't realize is how big they get. And even the dwarf blue spruces eventually will get big. So they're just slower growing. But genetically, they still have potential to be pretty large. Now, the ground cover ones, that not so much. But even Fat Albert, which tends to be really broad, it'll still get really tall if you give it enough time. Dwarf Alberta spruce is another one we could throw in there. Really slow growing because it's a genetic cripple, but it will still eventually get big enough that you'll probably have to remove it. So problems like that where, it's obviously going to cause problems to that little house, or we see this on the news all the time, right? So it's shallow rooted, it roots right there, which isn't necessarily a problem because we talked about most woody plants don't root super deep. But the problem with these is that they have such a dense canopy, the wind just really hits them like a sail and it absorbs that impact. And when it transfers it to the shallow root system and the soil is really moist, then a lot of times we see these blowing over. And you can see how shallow the root system is. I mean, it just ripped up all the dirt or all the sod off the top. I mean, they could practically go and lay new sod right on that and you would never even know because it really didn't take much of the dirt up. So that's why it's a question mark on that one. I mean, it does pretty well here overall, but is it the right tree for that space? And look at 20 years from now and not right when you plant it. You're like, oh, it's so cute. Look at that. You know. All right, so I want to open up this other presentation. Just give me a minute to switch over. The dirts, I don't know. Though the question here in the classroom was, what are the dirts that are sold at the front of the nursery? What are they good for? I'm not sure because I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about. A lot of times they're just soil amendments, which are fine. If you're going to use a soil amendment, and I guess it's important to make this clarification, soil amendments are great, especially if they're organic. If you're going to amend the soil, do a big area. Don't just do the soil that you're putting back into the planting hole. Do the bigger area instead. So till it in, whatever, but don't just amend the planting hole. Because if you make that soil considerably different than the surrounding soil, there's a tendency for the roots never to leave that really easy to grow in root zone out into the harder soil. So if you put the soil back into the hole from what you took out, then the tree is more likely to just continue on because it's already get used to something similar. But don't go get fired from your job. Like, I understand that businesses have to sell products to stay in business, and they're going to do what they do. I know other colleagues get in trouble for this too with the nurseries. And some of the nursery owners are, you know, maybe on the city council or whatever, and they're all bent about this. And they're going to say, well, we got to sell these products, whatever. But at the same point, from a science background, the research doesn't support that these products are helpful. In fact, it leans strongly the other way. And so I can't entirely side with the nurseries. Does that make sense? I understand. Yeah, they got to make money. They got to sell stuff. Unfortunately, I don't agree with that. And in my position, I don't have to agree with that. So soil pep is fine. Put it on top, right? Or till it in, but do the whole area. Do the whole flower bed. Don't just amend the soil in a planting hole. Yeah, just buy yards of it and put 3 inches on top. Let's see here. Okay. All right, I think, except for the little title, there it goes. All right, so I know there's 80 here. We are not getting there. I didn't even plan to get this far, honestly. I didn't think we'd get this far. So that's why I made it a separate PowerPoint, a separate note page. It's a reference. It's a reference booklet. That's really what I intended it to be. We'll go through some of these and tease some of these out more completely. And I'll pretty clearly dictate to you whether or not, in my opinion, it's recommended or not to plant them, just based on longevity, mess, pest problems, those kinds of things. So we'll start out, and these are in no particular order at all. Just when they got thought of and put on the paper. So beech, European beech. There are a whole bunch of cultivars of this out there. They tend as a group to do pretty well here. They're large trees. They need a large park space. They are really big trees, with the exception of the weeping beeches, which tend to be a little bit more conservative in canopy size. They still get really tall. They're better suited for smaller landscapes. Slow growing, quite slow growing, beautiful, majestic trees. The bark looks like it's been poured on, and there's lots of forms. So I've got the weeping one in the upper right picture there. There's purple beech, which is the lower right picture, just kind of a crappy leaf picture there of that. But you can see how the form is. That's still a young beech on the upper left picture. That's still a young beech. That's probably less than 20 years old. And it's got a long ways to go. There is an American beech as well, which is also a lovely plant. The only one that I know of in Utah is at Red Butte. They have a nice one by the waterfall. It's very broad, not as tall, but much broader. The wood on beech is extremely strong and durable, used a lot for furniture and veneers and tools and things like that. So there's one called tricolor beech. And so it gets these leaves on them that are variegated. This is a picture of one. This is down on BYU's campus. By about the middle of July, they look like hell because the variegations don't have very good water flow. So they don't photosynthesize. Really, there's no chlorophyll there. They don't get a lot of water movement through them. And so those areas just tend to scorch. And so they look like they want to be dead by the time we get to midsummer. This one doesn't look awful because it does get some shade late in the afternoon because it's on the east side of that building, but it still looks pretty hammered. So there's nothing you can do about it other than just trying to make sure that the soil stays moist so that it can take up water. Other trees get this too, like the maples will get leaf scorch in the summer, not because they're variegated, but just simply because they're losing more water than the plumbing system can provide. The soil can be wet. It's just the pipes aren't big enough. So it's normal in our climate. It's normal. If you moved it to Oregon, not an issue, right? Or a humid climate without as intense sunlight, beautiful. So they grow these pop out of a nursery in Oregon. They think, oh man, this is so beautiful. And then we put it in the Intermountain West and it's just awful. So.
It's something funny. So we share a backyard or side fence with a horse.
Oh, sharing property with
A horse.
Horse property.
And we bought this beautiful tricolor beech. And we were gonna plant it out there, so we set it by the fence. The next day we went out and it was like this tall.
Oh yeah, deer love it.
So now
Or
it's like-
horses love it, yeah.
So now it's more of a shrub.
Yep.
Planted somewhere else.
Right.
It's okay. But
Yep.
I did find a picture of, I don't think it's a beech. So pardon me if I'm on my phone.
You're good. So,
There's something that grows, we went side by siding down kind of over towards Delta, not quite to Delta. And it's like a purple bark, but it's super smooth, kind of like what you were describing the beach.
we might get to that. It's probably choke cherry or something else.
It could be.
Yeah.
Huh.
So big tooth maple. So this is one of the two maple trees native to Utah. We have big tooth maple, which is Acer grandidentatum. And then we have Rocky Mountain maple or Acer scopulorum, which is not as common as this one. This is the scrub maple. We can go up any of our canyons and near the rivers, we see this. So it doesn't grow super fast. It's not super tall. Although in a landscape situation where it gets adequate water, it can be pretty nice tree. The Conservation Garden Park has a little grove of them and they're pretty nice, but they do get irrigation. Nice fall color. That's the red that you see in the fall. Good for dry locations. That's tongue in cheek a little bit because I do see a lot of people using them, and a colleague who's now retired spent most of his career working on Selections of big tooth maple better suited for landscapes. If you look at where this plant is found in its natural habitat, it's not in super dry soil. And we put it in the valleys, and they're hotter and drier than the mountains are. So it's native to Utah, but your landscape is still probably not a very good choice for it. Unless you're up on the benches, up maybe into the scrub oak area a little bit better. I have seen it do okay in landscapes, but not in heavy soils and not in areas where it gets a lot of reflected heat and stuff. So just keep that in mind. It does work, but it's not necessarily the best choice. So just because it's native, remember that your landscape is native to anything, except for probably the sagebrush and grasses that were there originally. So your landscape is not a native environment at all. It's compacted, subsoil, salty, lots of reflected heat, retained heat, right? You've changed the wind patterns. It's not native to anything. So maybe starting with native plants or regionally adapted plants, which is actually a better choice of words for this, and then experimenting in your yard is what everybody really needs to do. There's no one blanket application of anything. Bur oaks, I love the oaks. They're oaks, we break oaks down into two main groups, the white oak group and the red oak group. As a general rule, the white oak group does great here in Utah. It's very tolerant of high pH soils, generally tolerant of landscape watering issues and conditions and those kinds of things. Bur oak is probably the best. It's also a very large tree, produces a lot of acorns. It's quite fast growing. So I said that there's some oaks that can be pretty fast growing. And it's also called mossy cup oak. And you can see from the acorn picture that the cap almost completely covers the actual seed inside with what looks like a mossy cup. And the white oak group, the leaves have rounded lobes. So the red oak group, the leaves have pointy lobes. Some of them even have spines on the lobes. So that's a really easy way to tell the difference. Common alder. This is a tree that's adapted to wet locations. So if you've got an area where the water is draining and you can't really deal with it because it's coming maybe off another property, alder might be a good choice for you. Especially if you have some room, it's kind of a big tree. It's a monoecious tree, which means it has separate male and female flowers on the same tree. That's the left picture there. You can see the male catkins, which just produce pollen, and the female cones that produce the little tiny seeds. It's very, very tolerant of crappy soils. Chokecherry, common chokecherry, Prunus virginiana. So there are some cultivars of this available. The most common one is Canada Red chokecherry. Chokecherry is super cold hardy. This grows well up through most of Canada to the north. It's very, very winter hardy. It's a small tree. It's good for underneath power lines. It's good for small spaces. The fruit is edible. The rest of the plant isn't. The plant actually produces cyanide. It makes its own. And in places where chokecherries are planted in thick groves in the summer when it blooms, sometimes people that walk through that will get sick. They'll get a headache. And there is some cyanide that comes off with the flowers when they bloom. And some people can be really sensitive. It's really small amounts, but it can make some people feel a little bit uneasy. They smell good. Yeah, they do smell good. It produces a lot of suckers. The upper right picture shows that. The root systems on them just tend to want to put out a lot of shoots. That's its natural habitat. It's more of a thicket forming shrub. And so we have to keep those pruned out, or they will overtake the tree. And if you have a nice cultivar that's grafted onto it, it won't be that cultivar in a few years because it will be crowded out. So Schubert, Canada Red, are some good cultivars. It also, chokecherry starts out green, a very bright green, and then as the leaves mature, they change to purple. And so for a while there, you'll have both colors contrasting on the same plant, and that's quite pretty. So here's one of the red oaks. So Quercus rubra, northern red oak. You can see the leaves have the sharp points on the lobes compared to the bur oak that we just saw. Out of all the red oak group, This one's probably the most tolerant of Utah's conditions. There's another one called Texas red oak, which I can't remember the exact species name on it. And some sources, I think, consider it a subspecies of this one. That one can be grown here in certain locations too. I know Red Butte's got some, but they need to be in areas where the soil drains really well, or they'll get super iron chlorotic. It's not that they're not winter hardy. Those kind of things are usually fine. It's that they're not very tolerant of the high soil pH, so they have time utilizing the type of iron and manganese that we have. So, but if you can keep them in an area where the soil drains really well and the root systems can breathe really well, a lot of times they'll get enough iron that way. So there's a really nice red oak in the Orem Arboretum here by the senior center. If you've ever been there, that is an arboretum, that park there. They used to have a map that you could get for that. But Marty Scheide was the forester there, he's retired, and I don't think anybody's maintained that since he's gone. But it's actually doing really well, but the soil is really sandy in that park. So, but beautiful form, it has a nice red fall color, and typically the oaks don't have good fall color. These red oaks are an exception to that. English oak, so looking at the lower right picture, what group is the English oak in? The white or the red? White. So because it's in the white oak group, this one also does pretty well here. I've seen it planted in a number of locations. Both of the pictures showing mature trees there are on BYU's campus. There you got the columnar white oak there, the fastigate or fastigiata cultivar. And then the upper right picture is the species, and that's at the alumni house. And that's a mature tree. I think it's probably, well, I don't know how mature it is. It's probably been there 100 years or so. So it's just getting started. But it's massive and it's beautiful. So I planted 2 English oaks in the first 2 houses I lived in Eagle Mountain. And I drive through that neighborhood every now and then, and they've just taken over the whole yard. It's so cool. You can't hardly even see the house, and it's so beautiful. But I knew that long term it was probably not going to be the right tree for the space, but they also tend to not have a lot of limb breakage. So these upright ones, these fastigate ones are nice for their form, but they tend to kind of splay out over time, and they require to keep them from doing that, they require a pretty sophisticated pruning technique and a cherry picker to get up there and do it. So they have their limitations for sure. Question? Pin oak, yeah. Pin oaks are strongly pyramidal, and I don't know if you got a cultivar that was more columnar. Yeah. 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 So, and pin oak is a red oak group. And so it's kind of hit and miss. Again, if you have a good spot for it, don't overwater it, might do okay. Yep. Crab apple or the malice. So we just put malice species in these kind of things because there's lots of species of what considers crab apple. So yeah, Malus floribunda, which is the classic crab apple, but you have Malus ioensis and you can have Malus sargentii, and there's a bunch of other ones that are kind of all included in this group that are similar. They're very winter hardy. They're all small trees, medium trees, usually suitable for small spaces and under power lines and those kind of things. If they bear fruit, the fruit is persistent, which means it stays on most of the winter. The birds will usually come and pick it off, and then it will fall usually at some point. And if they're very big, you can get kind of that sour mash smell. So a lot of people don't like that. Lots of sizes and lots of flower colors and lots of options when it comes to fruit colors as well. So you get yellow fruited ones, red, vibrant red, large and small fruit. There's thousands of varieties of these. Bechtel is the one picture to the left, the double flowering pink one. I don't remember what the other two are, to be honest with you, but just some pictures that I had that I thought showed being pretty. But the trend now is to go with the really small fruit ones, because then people don't notice that they don't really cause a problem in their landscape. European hornbeam is another upright columnar one. That's usually the one that's sold as the upright one. It's not, species isn't like that. A very, very tough, durable wood, very flexible wood, tolerant of shade and high pH. But this is one, because it's not native to arid climates, it tends to get a lot of leaf scorch in the summer. Even though the leaves aren't very big, they tend to scorch quite a bit. The hornbeam? No, nope, not at all. There's a pair of really nice hornbeam right at the sign for the Orem Senior Center. If you're over down that way, you see there's on either side of the big sign that says Orem Senior or Orem Friendship Center, whatever it says up there. There's two pyramidal hornbeams on either side of that. So you can see what those look like. Flowering pear, don't plant this. That's all I need to say. They self-destruct, they're brittle, they're really popular, and they have a useful life of maybe up to 20 years. People call me all the time. I got so many calls about this tree last summer, and they tell me how old it was, and I said, you've gotten what you're gonna get. 20 years is max. They self-destruct. They're really prone to fire blight, which is a bacterial disease that lots of plants in the rose family get. We also have to deal with this on apple and pear trees, which this is pear, and it does get fruit sometimes. But you can see on the picture on the left, a lot of the cultivars, and even the cultivars that aren't as prone to this, unless you prune them early, they will collect branches like this, and then they just peel like a banana when they get older. They're also prone to being iron deficient, being iron chlorotic as they get older and start to get some diseases in the root system. They'll get iron chlorotic. So just don't. There's better ones out there. Yeah.
First to get blossoms fall.
Yeah. And the blossoms smell terrible. They smell like rotting fish.
Fruit falls, and then stems fall,
Right.
and then the little.
And then the branches start to peel off.
It starts to spread all over the place, then you discover it.
Yeah, and it does root sucker as well. Yeah. So for a long time, the pear was recommended just simply because it was just new enough and hadn't been planted enough. We didn't have that many problems with it. Now it's so ubiquitous that the problems have followed it. And we're seeing the diseases and realizing that it's really not all that tolerant of our soil conditions either. Ginkgo, this is do plant this tree. This is a great tree for our climate. It does well here. I've seen it do well pretty much across the United States in almost every area that it's planted. This is a tree that is in the fossil record with dinosaurs. You can see it a lot when you go to museums, dinosaur museums, you see these in the displays in the fossil record. It's believed to have outlived all of its natural enemies. There are no known diseases or pests of ginkgo. We don't have aphid problems. We don't have borer problems. We don't have powdery mildew problems with this. It is a dioecious plant, which means male and female trees are separate. And the trees that you'll find in the nursery are male selections. So like Princeton Century or something like that. And that's because the fruit smells like vomit. So, but I will say I went to the botanical garden in Brooklyn, and they had a bunch of ginkgo in their parking lot. The parking lot was covered with fruit, and the whole parking lot smelled like a trash can at Lagoon. So, and I don't think, and I've seen this at BYU too, where they had some fairly young ginkgos in a grouping, and most of them were producing fruit. And I'm willing to bet that none of those were purchased as female trees, that they've reverted. And this happens a lot. We know this happens in nature. We know frogs do this. Some other species of fish do this, worms, right? So they can sense an imbalance in the population, and some of them can shift genders. And so that's just my own thing. I haven't done any research on this or looked it up, but I'm willing to bet that they bought trees from the nursery marked male, a male cultivar. And some of them have turned. So the fruit is awful. Yeah, probably less likely if it's just one tree in a yard, yeah. But I don't know, I haven't grown ever just one tree myself, so. Green ash, I'm not gonna say any more about ash because we said don't do it. Golden rain tree, Coleruteria paniculata. This is another small tree that's suitable for smaller spaces. It's quite drought tolerant. I did a bunch of research involving this tree when I was in graduate school, and it survived in some of the worst places in the state that we put it. So It does get the yellow flowers in July, which is pretty striking. And then it's got these kind of lantern-shaped seed pods in the fall, papery lanterns, but it can be a weedy mess because of all the seeds produced in those lanterns. So, yes, it's different than golden chain tree. That's a laburnum species. It does have a yellow flower, but they hang in chains, and they're not at the tips of the branches in the same kind of upright fashion. And golden chain tree, okay, golden rain tree looks pretty good most of the year. I don't think it looks good. I don't think the fruit pods look that good. Golden chain tree only looks good when it's in bloom, and it looks like you should just finish it off the rest of the season. It just looks awful because of where it bears the fruit, the flowers, right on the ends of the branches. It always looks like it's dying back. But I mean, normally it does fine here. Golden chain does that, but that's a laburnum genus. Yeah, probably will do okay. Hackberry, there are 3 species of hackberry that will grow here. This is just the occidentalis, which means the western one. And these can be quite large trees. They're pretty drought tolerant. They can become a little ragged and irregular. I see them a lot of times with some scorch and some dieback, but not always. Very adaptable to various soils. One of the biggest drawbacks to them, though, is that they get this what's called nipple gall on the leaves. And this is an insect. It's a little midge that actually kind of lives in the bark and overwinters in the bark, and then it lays its eggs on the leaves, and then the little larva burrows in and actually tricks the tree into growing this little house around it. And then it feeds in there. It's totally cosmetic. It doesn't do any harm to the tree at all. It's very, very difficult to control. You have to spray the trunk, and you have to knock down the adult midge population at the right time. And I haven't looked into it enough to really worry about it because it doesn't do any harm to the tree. But it does affect the look a lot. No, because that it doesn't spread anything else because it's host specific to hackberry. It's the hackberry nipple gall, and it's this midge that does it, and it's pretty exclusive. So it's not, you're not going to have that. There are other gall forming insects, lots of them, that can affect other stuff, but you can expect it with hackberry. I have never seen a hackberry that didn't have it. Some only have it a little bit, and some it's just really, really heavy loaded. So as far as maples go, a lot of the maples really struggle here, especially when you put them in the valleys, because they are a large leafed tree and the leaves are also very thin. So they have a lot of trouble slowing down water loss enough that they don't get leaf scorched in the summer here. Hedge maple is one of those that tolerates it pretty well. The leaves are smaller, a little thicker, and it can be hedged. So I've seen a lot of times where it is actually maintained as a hedge. It tolerates the shearing really well. It's not a very big tree. So the tree on the left there, that is at BYU again, that's a mature tree, and it's not more than maybe 25 feet tall, 20 feet, 25 feet. Lovely little small leaves on it. Queen Elizabeth is a good cultivar that's available, but it's kind of considered a utility, which means you can use it for a lot of different things. It fits into a lot of spaces and tolerates our conditions really well compared to like the eastern maples. We talked about thornless honey locust a little bit the second week. These are large trees with a pretty fast growth rate, very tolerant of most of our soil conditions. Although in drought-stressed areas or areas with salty soils, it will start leaf loss in July or August and kind of just have a little bit of leaf loss all the time, just dealing with stress. There are lots of cultivars out there, Imperial and Shade Master, which has a thicker canopy than most. You can see the mature species there on the right has kind of an open canopy. Sunburst, which is a yellow-leafed cultivar. I don't like those. My wife loves them, but to me that was like iron deficient, and I just can't train my brain to think about it otherwise. The ones that you buy, it's also a dioecious species. So the ones that are available in the store usually are male selection, so you don't get the seed pods on them. However, I have an Imperial in my yard, which is a male selection, and I get about 6 or 8 seed pods on it every year from basically kind of this one area. So yeah, so it's mostly dioecious, I guess. But horse chestnut, great grand tree. Boy, if you have one of these and it's in bloom, people will stop and ask you what tree it is. It's simply amazing. The fruit that it gets they're large with a spiky husk. They hurt when you throw them. It's hard to ride a bike underneath them. They had a whole row of these on campus at BYU, and you have to navigate around these golf balls all over the place. The fruit is not edible. It is not chestnut. It is horse chestnut, which is a different group. And generally they're inedible. So they won't kill you, but they have so much tannin in them that they can make you pretty sick. They have a big compound leaf, and they leaf scorch something fierce. Like some of the worst leaf scorch I've ever seen is on horse chestnut here in August and September. Big, big, thin leaves that just can't slow the water loss down enough. Japanese tree lilac, this one is fast gaining popularity as a good street tree, a good small street tree, a good small landscape tree. It is a syringa, so it is a cousin to the lilac bushes that you're probably familiar with. Very pretty. Typically everything in the varieties they have are white flowers, like ivory silk is a good cultivar. The leaves look like lilac, but they're more tree form. So they tend to have more of one central trunk and a nice canopy, but really they're only getting about 15 to 20 feet tall. So down on University Avenue here in Provo, down along BYU, they have a whole bunch of them there. And then in May, they look pretty amazing. They are prone to lilac, the ash lilac borer, like ash and the other lilac are. But normally if the trees are healthy and not stressed, it's not a big problem. Japanese maple, this is another one where I put a question mark by it whether or not to use it. I generally advise people not to plant it, but if they do, plant it as an experiment, and don't be too bent if it goes south, because it's an understory tree. It's native to shade and moist, humid climates. And we want to put it in a landscape that doesn't have any of those things. So a lot of times they just leaf scorch right out and die. All of these pictures, well, not all of them, the two on the right are taken in Utah. The one there is the blood good. That one I took at Red Butte. The other one is, that might be a blood good too. That one is in a little microclimate at BYU down where they excavated down, and these lower levels are like a whole story below ground. So it only actually gets a little bit of direct sun during the day, and it's super happy. So, and occasionally I'll find people that have planted them in even what I would consider pretty stressful places, and they're doing okay. So again, it's just that microclimate if it's just right. But more often than not, they just start dying back from the top, and they'll die back to where they're grafted, and then you don't have the Japanese maple anymore. So kind of a landscape loser for most people.
We
So
have quite a few. I know that one of the things I've learned is that they would not be buried.
yeah, they're not. Yeah, they're very sensitive to being buried too deep. Yep, for sure. And that's maples generally. They're not very tolerant of it. They need well draining soil too. So where I live in Saratoga Springs, for maples, because we have this heavy salty clay loam soil. Maples are just right out. So they just don't work at all. Kentucky coffee tree. Okay, this is a legume. So we've talked about some legumes already. We've talked about honey locust, which is a legume. Black locust is a legume. Legume is a huge family, the pea family. And as a group, I think they're found on every continent except Antarctica, one of the most diverse genre of plants, family of plants. And as a group, they're just so tolerant of really harsh conditions. So a lot of them do well here. Kentucky coffee tree, this is native in Oklahoma in the Midwest. And it does well here. Again, BYU, it's dioecious male and female trees. This is the female tree they have on campus. They have another male tree that's just to the north of it. I think it's to the north, or to the south, excuse me. They're large, pretty large trees with a nice rounded canopy, very adapted to many soil types. The female trees get these big fat bean pods on them. The seeds are huge. They're bigger than a quarter, each individual seed in there, but it kind of looks like a big flattened pea in there. And as settlers moved west, they actually did take the seeds and roast them and make a type of coffee out of them, which is where it gets the common name. But tough, really tough as nails. Now the lindens, and we're probably about out of time. We're close. Lindens as a group, there's 3 linden species that do pretty well here. The only one I think that I've got in here is little leaf linden, because I think it's probably one of the best ones to grow here. Well, actually, no, that's probably silver linden, but it's not as common. Quite pyramidal in shape. You can see that when after flowers, you get these little seeds on them, and then you kind of have that papery bract that gives the trees a real interesting look later in the season. But the real fun thing about these is the blossoms in June. All of the lindens have an amazing smell to the flowers, and you haven't had good honey until you've had linden honey. It is phenomenal. So if you can find honey or buy honey locally from somebody that knows that there's a lot of linden trees nearby, it is the bomb. It is so good. So if you, down where our county office used to be, down at the old courthouse, there's some linden trees planted along the road by the parking lot. Go there in June when they're in flower, and it will sound, you can't not hear the buzzing of all the bees. It's literally covered with bees. So awesome. So if you want a good bee tree, plant these in your yard, right? Mulberry. So this is another questionable tree. Does okay here. It was actually intentionally planted in southern Utah for silkworm industry, because the silkworms feed on mulberry. Didn't pan out, but it's pretty well adapted here. It's tolerant of really all of our crappy soil conditions. It's a fast grower. Most of the selections that you can find are fruitless, but that just means less fruit. So real popular variety is chaparral, which is these umbrella ones. These are at Thanksgiving point, and they prune them to keep them looking like that. But those still get fruit, and they're fruitless. So they still get a lot of staining on the sidewalk, and the brides that come through there have to be careful. They'll stain their shoes and their dresses with it. Yeah, if you haven't had fruit, then you're lucky probably. But I know a lot of people who like the fruit, so yeah. There's also a pretty popular cultivar called contorta, the contorted filbert, which grows the really twisty stems. Florists love it because it really looks good in flower arrangements, even just the bare stems. And there's also a contorted willow that they do the same thing with. But there's 3 different leaf morphologies up there to show you that's normal variation on mulberry. So you can have leaves with these big deep lobes like the lower right corner. You can have lobes like on this contorted one where they're not lobed at all. And then you can have some that have just all kind of variations on how they're lobed, or even just one lobe in one side and not all the way around. And that confuses people because they think that, they learned it one way and that's always how it is. There's lots of trees have variations on how they'll present on their leaves, and it's just becoming familiar with those. Norway maple, so it's actually well adapted to our soils. It's a pretty good tree. Needs well-draining soil. Maples as a group are prone to verticillium wilt, which can really come with there's root problems. It's not really a root disease, but it gets in and blocks up the plumbing, the water system. Slower growing tree. Lots of cultivars. Emerald Queen has been popular for a long time. Crimson King, Fairview, Schwedler Eye, Fastens Black. This one big picture on the left is Fastens Black. It's super, super dark leaves. It's not available in the trade anymore, but if you could propagate it and sneak a cutting off a BYU's tree, maybe. But they're nice trees, but the leaf scorch is the big issue, and aphids. So that leaf scorch in August can be pretty severe. And a lot of people think it's a fungus and they want to spray it. So we'll get called, what can I spray on my maple tree? Just leave it alone. It's doing its thing. River birch is another one that is iffy. A lot of people use it. It doesn't love our high pH soil. It's native to areas. It's super winter hardy, Like I was in Alaska and this is like the native tree in all the mountains in lower Alaska. Like it's everywhere. But they have soil pHs in the 5s and we're in the 8s. So it likes it moist. So most yards it fits okay. But when you add a lot of irrigation water to a tree that's already struggling to get iron, it really, a lot of times becomes really iron deficient and we get a lot of dieback in them. But the bark peels naturally like that. That's how it looks. Some people don't like that, including myself. But Eastern redbud, another great little tree. This will be the last one we talk about. Another good understory tree, but needs well-draining soil. I planted a number of these over the years, and they've all randomly died. They've gone from being really healthy to just simply not coming back at all the next year. And in one case, it actually flowered, leafed out, started to leaf out, and then it just died. And we dug it up and it had severe root rot. And it was on the sandiest soil you can imagine. It was almost like playground sand. So well draining, not a problem, but it just didn't make it. But I've seen some growing in some areas, like even on, there's a street corner by my parents' house in Lehigh where we pass 2 really old Eastern redbuds. And it's the most desolate heat area, hot off the asphalt, surrounded by concrete. And they are the happiest things. So it's just like what we say with the Japanese maple. You know, the odds are against you it being a long-lived tree, but I'm not saying don't try it if you really want to try it. Yeah, some of the cultivars might do a little bit better, and they have a lot of cultivars. There's weeping ones and some that have white flowers and things, and just a lovely, lovely tree, but a little hit and miss in my experience with how long it will last in the landscape. And that's all we have time for. So thank you guys. Yeah, you expect a tree is going to be there forever. But as I said, the average life of a landscape tree really is closer to that 10 to 15 year mark. In fact, I saw one study that said the average life of a landscape tree is more around 7 years. So, I mean, it varies a lot, but when you think about how many landscape trees are planted in new plantings, most of them only make it the first year or two, so they're going to push the average to that. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And we'll see you guys on Thursday.